Do you really gotta know theory to win under 1500? Of course not. There's a line in the Sicilian Defense that punishes about 90% of e4 players in a way that's fast, easy, and doesn't need any prep at all. And since most opponents just aren't ready for it, they end up making the same mistakes over and over. And I'm gonna show you exactly how to punish every single one of them. The game kicks off with e4 and the Sicilian Defense shows up with c5. Then knight to f3, e6, and the opponent pushes the pawn to d4 to really open up the Sicilian. And right away we capture that central pawn because this trade is almost always favorable for black since we're giving up a side pawn to take our opponent's central pawn. And whenever you hear someone say that the Sicilian is opened, it's just a way of explaining that this trade creates two half-open files, the C file for black and the D file for white. After that capture, the opponent's got this knight sitting really nicely in the center of the board, and now we bring our knight to f6, going after that pawn. If white just decides to push it forward to kick the knight, we got queen to a5 check right there, and we win the pawn. So if that advance comes, you already know exactly how to punish it. And the right way for white to defend is with knight to c3. And then you go bishop to b4, pinning that knight. This is the Sicilian line known as the bishop attack, also called the pin variation, and it's obviously one of the simplest and easiest Sicilian lines you can play. In other Sicilian variations, you're going to see a6 played pretty often, and yeah, it looks like it goes against opening principles, but the whole point is to get ready for b5 so you can develop the bishop to b7 later on. Now, let's get back to the variation I'm showing you and the plan behind it, and really, there's no secret here. The main idea is to trade off the knight, take the pawn when the chance comes up, and that way you end up messing up your opponent's pawn structure. And the threat's pretty clear. If the opponent doesn't react, we just take the pawn, put pressure on that knight, and then we end up doubling their pawns. And from there, you just play to go after that weakened structure. Most of the time you get to this position when players stick to the main opening moves. But before we go there, it's worth checking out a few mistakes your opponent might make pretty often and that you can punish right away. A really common mistake, especially from players in the 500 to 1500 range, you'll see right at the start of the Sicilian. White goes e4, you answer with c5, then comes bishop to c4, e6, and knight to f3, and at this point your opponent's basically playing it like it's the Italian game, but that plan simply doesn't work in this position. In the traditional Italian game, black usually goes e5, which keeps the bishop on c4 active, pointing straight at f7. But in the Sicilian, the structure is different because the pawn sits on e6 instead of e5, and that bishop on c4 basically loses all its punch. So how do you punish this mistake? First, you develop your knight to f6, going after that e4 pawn, and the most common reply you will see from your opponent is pawn to d3. If he pushes the pawn, you've got two options. The first one's the most aggressive and the most exciting, though you'll probably have to play with your king in the center. In this line, the correct and strongest move is pawn to d5, immediately going after the opponent's bishop. If he responds by capturing en passant, you're actually happy because you recapture and develop your bishop at the same time. And if instead he goes after the knight, you just take his bishop. Then he's going to grab the pawn on g7 and you recapture with your bishop. After that, all you do is play pawn to b6, followed by bishop to b7. And the position you get from here is totally playable for black. Now let's check out the most common move, where your opponent defends with pawn to d3. And the key here is to strike right back with d5, taking over the center. After the trade in the middle, white usually goes bishop to b5 check. And here, instead of blocking with knight to c6, you should go knight to d7. If you put it on c6, white can trade and mess up your pawn structure. But on d7, that bishop just ends up wasting time, either by taking a knight and letting you recapture with development, or by getting chased away with a6 followed by b5. So after castles, bishop to e7, knight to c3, castles again, and bishop to g5, you push a6 and then b5, taking over space on the queen side. And the result's pretty clear. You end up with a much better position, with a lead in development and control of the center. Now we reach a spot where your opponent plays a little more precisely this time. It starts with e4, c5, knight to f3, and we reply with e6. He keeps going with pawn to d4, we capture with pawn takes d4, and he recaptures with knight takes d4. And then we go knight to f6, putting pressure on that e4 pawn. At this point, white's got two main ways to defend that pawn. The best one is knight to c3, but before that, let's quickly mention bishop to d3, which you'll also see every now and then. It's a pretty unambitious move, but still, there's no immediate tactical threat against it. After that, we go knight to c6, looking to trade. The best thing for white here is to capture, so knight takes c6. We recapture with the pawn, and here's a key detail. Always recapture toward the center. That gets us ready to push the pawn to d5. Most of the time, white castles here, and that's exactly when we push the pawn to d5, building a really solid center. Sure, this plan does slow down development a little, because we've already pushed quite a few pawns by now, but the idea is pretty clear. In the next few moves, you bring the bishop out to e7, get castled, and start pushing your central pawns. And what you get is a really comfortable position where black's got clear, straightforward plans. This whole sequence happens if your opponent plays bishop to d3 and then takes the knight when you offer that trade. But the point is, no matter if he takes it or not, you can still follow up with a pawn push to d5. So let's say he goes for something else. For example, bishop to e3, which is actually pretty common. In that case, you stick with the same plan and push pawn to d5. And most of the time, even with the bishop already developed, he still ends up taking the knight on c6 anyway. And that leads to a structure that's almost identical to the one we looked at before, with the same strategic plans for black. If he takes the pawn on d5 with his pawn, you just recapture with knight takes d5. And here's what happens. You're already threatening his bishop, so he's basically forced to trade. After that, he still has to pull back the bishop from e3 so it doesn't hang, and that's where you've got a little detail to work with. The b file is half open. At this point, I'd recommend rook to b8 because that puts pressure on the b2 pawn, and you end up forcing your opponent into awkward moves like b3, bishop to c3, or queen to c1. All moves he'd really prefer to avoid. And just by doing that, you're already putting real pressure on the position. But if instead he plays knight to c3, then the idea is to pin that knight with your bishop. And that's the line we'll usually be going for in most games. The immediate threat here is on that e4 pawn, so naturally, your opponent's going to try to defend it. If he goes bishop to d3, you already know the pattern. That bishop really doesn't do much. It's just a passive move. So the right sequence plays out just like before. You go knight to c6, looking for the trade. If he captures with knight takes c6, you recapture with the pawn. And after he castles, you push the pawn to d5 and you reach a solid position where black's got clear plans to follow. Here's an important detail. At any point, you might think about taking his knight on c3 with the idea of doubling his pawns and creating some weaknesses. But remember, if you do that, you're giving up the bishop pair. So for now, keep bishop takes knight in your back pocket as a resource and save that trade for when it really matters in the position, all right? What's the right move for white here? We've already seen that bishop to d3, just defending that pawn, leaves white slightly worse. So the best move, even if it looks counterintuitive, is pawn to e5. This push is strong because it stops queen to a5 from coming in with check, and it also keeps the pressure on that knight on c3. So the usual move you'll see after this is knight to d5, putting pressure on the knight and forcing black to react. If your opponent tries to defend with the bishop, this is the key idea. Knight takes knight right away. If the opponent recaptures with the bishop, we trade pieces, and that's it, goal achieved. You've left him with a totally wrecked pawn structure. Then queen to c7 jumps in with a double attack, and you end up winning material no matter what. So the best move for your opponent after you go knight takes c3 is to take back with the pawn. That way, he keeps his bishop on the board and avoids giving up the initiative immediately. From there, you just go bishop to e7, and your position is really comfortable because your opponent's stuck with doubled pawns on the c-file, easy targets for you to go after, while you've got no real weaknesses to worry about. And here's the big question. What can white do to look for counterplay? After knight to d5, there actually is an idea, but it's a pretty tough move to find. The move here is queen to g4, and this idea is super effective. But here's the thing. It's the kind of move you'd only know if you've studied the theory before. It's not something you just come up with over the board, playing by intuition, because it doesn't directly deal with the threat of the double attack on the knight. If black goes ahead and takes the knight anyway, White follows up with queen takes g7, threatening to take the rook on the king side right away. And here's the key point. There's no discovered attack that really makes up for leaving that rook hanging. So black answers with rook to e8, defending the 8th rank, and now it's up to white to figure out this position. Taking the knight here is totally out of the question. If you grab the knight, bishop takes c3, and suddenly the rook's hanging, the knight's hanging, everything in white's position is just collapsing. But white's plan was never to take the knight anyway. Right from the start, the whole idea was simply the beautiful move, pawn to a3. Now, this is wild. We're up a piece, but the position's way worse, and the reason's pretty simple. Their queen's all the way in, just non-stop pressure. Any check we'd have here comes from the bishop, but if we go for that, it's just gonna get snapped off by a pawn. Let's say you try knight to b5 check, hoping to win his knight. He simply goes pawn takes bishop, you recapture his knight, and then bishop to h6 jumps in, piling on even more pressure. And suddenly, we're in a much worse spot. So if black goes ahead and takes the knight, this line just doesn't work. Before that, you've got to play an in-between move, a defensive one, pushing the pawn to g6. This move, however, comes with a trade-off. By pushing the pawn, you weaken the king side, and that totally changes black's strategic plan. Now the goal should be to castle queenside, which you can do pretty safely. White then replies with queen to g3, and this is the only move that really does two jobs at once. It defends the knight and protects the central pawn. That's why it's actually a little better than just going with the simpler bishop to d2. If white goes bishop to d2, black can capture on c3, going back to the same idea of wrecking the opponent's structure, and then drop the bishop back safely. That's why queen to g3 ends up being just a bit better. Here, I'd recommend queen to a5, putting more pressure on the knight. The idea is to force the opponent to answer with bishop to d2, defending the knight, and then we just go into a sequence of trades. So we go knight takes knight. If he takes back with the bishop, then we just go bishop takes bishop. If he takes back with the queen, then we trade queens, and he ends up with doubled pawns. Or, in another move order, we go queen takes the pawn with check, and once again we come out with a clear advantage. At some point in this line, the best he can do is take back with the pawn, and either way it wrecks his pawn structure. Now we just drop the bishop back, and our main plan, which at this point is even clearer, is to castle queenside. So we go knight to c6, and after the trade, we take back with the d-pawn, and that opens up the diagonal for bishop to d7, getting ready to castle long. From this point, you've got a really comfortable position to play. And now you not only get the logic behind the Sicilian with the pin, but you also know how to punish common mistakes, activate the right files, and turn small slips into real strategic edges. Just having this knowledge already puts you ahead of most players who just repeat memorized moves without ever knowing why. But there's one thing almost nobody tells you, and this is where most players get stuck. Because even after understanding all of this, the win slips away on some tiny invisible detail. That moment when your opponent plays something off script and you can't tell if it's a real threat or just a bluff. And that's the key. Knowing the opening isn't enough. What really matters is calculation. Recognizing the themes, picking the right moves, and seeing what's coming before a piece even starts to move. Click now before you go. I'm going to show you the method I use to think clearly in these moments. A simple step-by-step that saved me from throwing away many winning positions. Click now and you'll feel how the wins start coming much more often, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you watched all the way to this point and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.